The autumn of 1307 descended upon France with an unnatural stillness, as if the very air sensed the violence about to unfold. In commanderies and preceptories stretching from Paris to the Pyrenees, Knights Templar performed their evening rituals, white mantles gleaming in candlelight, prayers rising toward vaulted stone ceilings that had witnessed 2 centuries of devotion. They did not know that sealed letters had already been distributed to every royal bailiff and seneschal across the kingdom, orders marked with King Philip IV's cipher and bearing a single instruction: do not open until the evening of October 12th. At dawn on Friday the 13th of October, the hammering began. Royal soldiers burst through gates that had never been breached by enemy force. In the Paris Temple, Grandmaster Jacques de Molay was seized in his chambers, the sanctuary where he had conducted the order's business now violated by men who served a king drowning in debt. The charges read against the assembled knights seemed calculated to invoke maximum horror: denial of Christ, worship of an idol called Baphomet, obscene rituals conducted in darkness. Across France, approximately 15,000 individuals connected to the order, knights, sergeants, chaplains, servants, were arrested in a single coordinated strike unprecedented in medieval history. But even as iron chains closed around Templar wrists in France, something else was unfolding along the northern borders of Christendom. Intelligence had flowed through networks built over generations, whispered by merchants whose trade routes connected Mediterranean to North Sea, conveyed by sympathetic clergy who watched Philip's ministers draft accusations in candle-lit chambers. Records from the period, fragmented and deliberately obscured, suggest that certain Templar commanders received warning. The exact timeline remains disputed among modern historians, but the window was narrow. Between September 14th, when the arrest warrants were sealed, and October 13th, when they were executed, some portion of the order's assets began to move. Ships vanished from La Rochelle harbor on the Atlantic coast, their departure unrecorded in any surviving manifest. Wagon trains traveled south toward the Pyrenees along routes the Templars had maintained for decades. And in the confusion of those final weeks, men whose names would never appear in trial records slipped across borders into territories beyond Philip's immediate reach. The Templar preceptory at La Rochelle, when finally seized by royal agents, stood empty. The legendary treasure, 2 centuries of accumulated wealth from banking operations that had made the order indispensable to monarchs across Europe, had disappeared as completely as morning mist beneath Mediterranean sun. Far to the north, beyond English-controlled territories and papal authority, Scotland presented a unique refuge. King Robert the Bruce, who had secured his throne through civil war and the murder of John Comyn before the altar of Greyfriars Church in Dumfries, stood excommunicated by Pope Clement V, the same pontiff who would soon issue bulls commanding all Christian monarchs to arrest Templars and seize their properties, held no authority over a Scottish king already condemned as a regicide and usurper. Bruce's kingdom was fighting for survival against English invasion, desperately in need of experienced warriors and the military expertise the Templars had accumulated through 2 centuries of warfare in the Holy Land. The documentary silence that follows is profound. Between 1307 and 1314, Scottish records mention Templars only in the context of nominal property transfers to the Knights Hospitaller, as mandated by papal decree. Individual knights who had appeared regularly in charters and witness lists simply vanish from official documentation. Yet archaeological evidence tells a different story. Carved stones bearing distinctive imagery begin appearing at sites across southern Scotland. Grave markers display symbols that would remain enigmatic for centuries. And 7 years after the arrests in France at a battlefield near Stirling, something unexpected would occur. A military victory so improbable that legends would immediately form around it. Legends that persist to this day. The mystery begins not with what was built, but with what was hidden, not in vaults beneath chapel floors, but in the silence between the lines of official history. To understand what transpired in Scotland requires understanding what the Knights Templar had become by 1307. Founded around 1119 in Jerusalem by 9 French knights led by Hugues de Payens, the order began with a stated purpose both humble and dangerous: protecting Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land through territories where bandits and hostile forces threatened every mile. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem granted them quarters directly atop the Temple Mount, in the ruins where Solomon's temple had once stood. From this location, They took their name, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ, and of the Temple of Solomon. But contemporary chronicles note something peculiar about those first 9 years. The founding knights accepted no new members. They conducted no documented military operations. They appeared to protect no pilgrims. William of Tyre, writing in the 12th century, expressed suspicion about what the Templars actually did during this period of obscurity. Archaeological surveys conducted by British engineers in 1867 would later discover extensive tunnel systems beneath the Temple Mount, passages containing artifacts consistent with Templar occupation. Whether they excavated in search of ancient treasures, sacred relics, or simply to understand the geography of their headquarters remains subject to speculation. What cannot be disputed is that when Hugues de Payens finally returned to Europe in 1127, he carried something that transformed the order overnight. Within months of that return, the Templars received papal recognition at the Council of Troyes in 1129. Pope Innocent II's bull Omni Datum, Optimum of 1139, granted them extraordinary privileges: exemption from local taxes and laws, freedom to cross any border, spiritual authority answerable only to Rome. They became the first truly international organization since the fall of the Roman Empire, operating a financial network that historians have compared to modern banking. A pilgrim could deposit funds at a Templar preceptory in London and withdraw them in Jerusalem using encrypted letters of credit that only Templar officials could verify. This system generated enormous wealth, which the order used to acquire more than 9,000 properties across Europe. The Templar presence in Scotland began early in this expansion. In 1128, Hugh de Payens traveled north and met with King David I, one of medieval Scotland's most powerful monarchs. David granted the order lands in Midlothian, establishing the preceptory at Ballintrodoch, later renamed Temple, as their Scottish headquarters. Between 1128 and 1307, Templar holdings expanded across southern and eastern Scotland. They administered estates, collected rents, participated in the kingdom's military and ecclesiastical affairs. Records document their presence in at least 9 counties. What happened to these established operations after October 1307 is where the documentary evidence begins to fragment. In England, King Edward II reluctantly arrested Templars in January 1308, months after the French roundup. The English crown was less enthusiastic than Philip IV about destroying the order, and trials proceeded with less brutality. Many English Templars were eventually pensioned off or transferred to other religious houses. But in Scotland, something different occurred. There is no evidence of arrests. King Robert the Bruce, excommunicated and fighting for his kingdom's independence, had neither the means nor the incentive to enforce papal edicts. The few Templar properties in Scotland were nominally transferred to the Hospitallers, but the knights themselves seem to have vanished from official records without trials, without executions, without documented departures. Yet traces remain. Carved stones at Temple in Midlothian, grave slabs at Kilmartin in Argyll displaying no names or heraldic devices, only the incised impression of full-sized swords. Architectural modifications to churches and fortifications across southern Scotland, constructed in styles consistent with Templar building traditions, dated through modern analysis to the early 14th century. These were not local builders copying generic monastic layouts, but professionals applying specialized knowledge. The evidence suggests not destruction, but absorption, a process that left physical traces while official documentation remained conspicuously silent. Statistical analysis by modern researchers indicates that at least 335 Templars avoided capture in the initial French arrests. Maritime historians note that autumn Atlantic crossings, while hazardous, were possible for experienced sailors with good ships. The Templars had such ships, and extensive maritime experience. Where those who escaped might have gone remains a question answered not by documents, but by patterns in stone and landscape. The breakthrough in understanding the Scottish Templar phenomenon came not from a single dramatic excavation, but from the cumulative weight of evidence assembled through decades of archaeological investigation. In 2016, during routine maintenance of the churchyard wall at Temple in Midlothian, construction workers uncovered 2 carved stone slabs buried in the foundations. The discovery triggered an immediate archaeological response. Temple, a village whose very name commemorates its Templar origins, had long been associated with the order, but physical evidence from the crucial period between 1307 and 1320 had proven frustratingly scarce. The stones, upon examination by teams from Edinburgh, displayed characteristics consistent with 12th or 13th century funerary monuments. Their incorporation into a later wall suggested they had been repurposed, removed from their original contexts. Most significantly, their inscriptions and iconographic elements employed symbolic vocabularies that could be traced to Templar contexts in France and the Holy Land. The carving techniques matched those documented at sites where Templar presence was uncontested. What made the discovery particularly significant was its context. These stones had been deliberately hidden, incorporated into a structure built centuries after the Templar dissolution, suggesting someone had considered them worth preserving, even when overt Templar associations might invite dangerous scrutiny. 2 years earlier, another discovery had emerged from an unexpected quarter. 2 church bells in Dumfriesshire, which had hung in their tower for 900 years, were conclusively identified through extensive investigation involving international academics in paleography, bell history, and heraldry, as having been sponsored by a 12th century knight with documented connections to the early Templar presence in southwestern Scotland. Victorian-era misinterpretation had obscured the bell's origins. Modern imaging techniques combined with comparative analysis revealed that these bells had originally hung over a convent at Sacro Nemore, Holy Wood, an establishment linked to Templar operations in the region. The inscriptions cast into their bronze surfaces employed Latin formulations characteristic of military religious orders. At Kilmartin in Argyll, archaeological analysis of carved grave slabs preserved in the parish church revealed another layer of the mystery. The collection includes stones dating from approximately 1300 onward, a period precisely coinciding with the Templar suppression. Among these monuments are several displaying no names, no heraldic devices, no family affiliations, only the incised impression of life-sized straight swords. This stark anonymity stands in sharp contrast to typical medieval funerary practices, where identity, lineage, and achievements were proclaimed in stone for eternity. The swords themselves are depicted with specific details, crossguards, pommels, blade shapes, that correspond to weapons used by military orders in the early 14th century. Carbon dating and stratigraphic analysis of burial sites associated with these stones indicated interments occurring in the decades immediately following 1307. Excavations conducted under license revealed burial orientations and evidence suggesting military individuals of significant status. Yet none appear in the documentary record. No wills, no charters of land transfer, no entries in burgh records. They were buried with honor, but without official recognition. Shadows in the historical record, their identities erased or concealed. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at former Templar preceptories revealed building foundations that did not match later architectural phases, suggesting construction episodes that went unrecorded. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from these structures consistently returned dates in the early 14th century, precisely when the order was officially extinct. Archival research uncovered gaps in the documentary record, missing folios in monastic cartularies, pages cut from royal registers, entire sequences of dates showing no official business transactions. These absences were not random losses to time and decay, but showed signs of deliberate editing. In some cases, stub edges remained visible where parchment had been removed with precision. Marginal notes in 13th century hands referenced the Brothers of the Temple, but the passages they annotated had been obliterated. The modern discovery was not merely of objects, but of a pattern of concealment spanning centuries. Evidence confirmed that Templars had reached Scotland, that they were absorbed into its military and religious structures, and that powerful interests had worked systematically to ensure this absorption left minimal traces in official history. The mystery had not been solved, but its dimensions had become clearer, mapped not in what was recorded, but in what was deliberately left unwritten. Reconstructing the timeline of Templar presence in Scotland required assembling fragments from sources never meant to be connected. The process began with what was definitively documented: Hugh de Payens' visit in 1128, King David I's land grants, the establishment of Ballintrodoch as Scottish headquarters. Between 1128 and 1307, Templar presence expanded across at least 9 Scottish counties. They administered estates, collected revenues, trained knights, participated in the kingdom's military operations. This much appeared in charters, witness lists, legal documents. The question was what happened after October 1307, when the documentary trail abruptly ended. In England, arrests began in January 1308. Records preserved in the National Archives document the proceedings. Note confessions extracted under limited torture, record transfers of properties and eventual dispersal of prisoners. But these same English records contain a telling detail. A letter from King Edward II to his sheriffs ordering seizure of Templar properties in our realm, explicitly noting that properties in Scotland were beyond his authority, since Robert the Bruce controlled that kingdom. This acknowledgement preserved a negative space, evidence that something was happening in Scotland beyond English observation or control. Scottish ecclesiastical records showed suspicious discontinuities. At several abbeys with known Templar connections, Melrose, Holyrood, folios covering the years 1307 to 1320 were missing. Not lost to age, but cut from bindings with deliberate precision. Stub edges remained visible in some volumes, showing where parchment had been removed. Royal exchequer rolls, which should have documented crown revenues from former Templar estates, showed unexplained gaps for properties that clearly remained productive in later periods. Revenue was apparently being collected but not recorded, or recorded in registers subsequently destroyed. Comparative analysis of architectural elements across suspected Templar sites revealed coordinated activity. Carved symbols appearing at multiple locations, specific forms of crosses, geometric patterns, masons' marks, suggested craftsmen working to common templates. At Temple in Midlothian, architectural modifications dated to the early 14th century employed construction techniques documented at Templar castles in the Crusader states. Someone with specialized military engineering knowledge was applying that expertise at precisely the time when the order officially no longer existed. The first potential public emergence of absorbed Templars came at the Battle of Bannockburn on June 23–24, 1314. Robert the Bruce faced an English army estimated at 15,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry. Contemporary accounts describe the battle's climax. As Scottish schiltrons pushed forward, a fresh force appeared on the Scottish flank. English chroniclers described them as unexpected reinforcements whose arrival caused panic. Scottish sources referred to them simply as reserves. The identity of this flanking force remains one of the battle's enduring mysteries. Some researchers have proposed they were Templars. Statistics based on the number who avoided capture in France suggest 29 to 48 knights and sergeants could have reached Scotland. Others dismiss this as romantic speculation unsupported by documentation. What cannot be disputed is the strategic sophistication Bruce demonstrated. His tactics at Bannockburn, the use of terrain, the coordination of infantry schiltrons, the timing of cavalry deployment, reflected military knowledge consistent with Templar expertise developed through 2 centuries of warfare. Whether this resulted from Templar instruction, captured Templar manuals, or simply parallel development of best military practices remains debatable. Archaeological evidence at Kilmartin, grave slabs marking anonymous military burials from this period, suggests that skilled warriors were present in regions connected to Bruce's power base, buried with honor but without identification. The pattern that emerges from cross-referencing multiple fragmentary sources suggests a deliberate process. Templar refugees reaching Scotland, integration into Bruce's military forces, deployment at strategic locations along invasion routes from England. The documentary silence was not accidental but designed. Coordinated erasure across ecclesiastical, royal, and local records. What survived did so because it could not be easily removed. Stones already carved, buildings already constructed, burials already completed. The timeline could be reconstructed not through what was written but through what physical evidence remained despite efforts to obscure it. By 1320, the process appeared complete. Templars had ceased to exist as a distinct entity in Scotland, but the knowledge they brought, military tactics, architectural expertise, organizational principles, had been absorbed into Scottish institutions. The order had not been destroyed, but transformed. The systematic erasure of the Scottish Templars from history was not accidental, but the result of deliberate acts by multiple parties with overlapping motives. When scholars attempt to trace the order's presence between 1307 and the mid-14th century, they encounter not merely absence of documentation, but evidence of active suppression. Monastic cartularies, registers where religious houses recorded property transactions, legal agreements, and significant events, display suspicious discontinuities. At several Scottish abbeys with known Templar connections, folios covering 1307 to 1320 are missing. The pages were not lost to age. They were cut from bindings with deliberate precision. In some cases, stub edges remain visible, showing where parchment was removed. These gaps correspond exactly to the period when Templar refugees would have been most active. Royal records present similar anomalies. The Scottish Exchequer rolls documenting crown revenues and expenditures are notably incomplete for Robert the Bruce's reign. Sequences of years show no entries for properties that should have generated income, including former Templar estates officially transferred to the Knights Hospitaller. Yet evidence from later periods confirms these properties remained productive, suggesting revenue was collected but not recorded, or recorded in registers subsequently destroyed. English chroniclers, who had every reason to document Scottish acceptance of heretical Templars as propaganda against Bruce, are strangely silent. This suggests either they lacked definitive evidence, or their accounts were suppressed by later editors who found such claims inconvenient when Anglo-Scottish relations stabilized. Church archives reveal perhaps the most telling silences. Bishops' registers recording ordinations, ecclesiastical appointments, and disciplinary matters show gaps in several Scottish dioceses during the crucial period. The register for the Diocese of St. Andrews, which included Templar properties in Fife, lacks entries for 1308-1315. Paleographic analysis of surviving sections reveals signs of alteration, passages scraped away using pumice or blade, text overwritten, dates modified. In one instance, a marginal note references the Brothers of the Temple at Ballintroduch, but the passage it annotates has been obliterated. The note survived because it was written in the margin, overlooked by whoever systematically removed references from the main text. These are not random losses, but targeted removals designed to obscure specific information. The deliberateness becomes clearer when comparing Scottish records with those from other regions. In England, Templar trial proceedings were documented extensively. In France, inquisitorial records provide horrifying detail about arrests, interrogations, executions. In the Iberian kingdoms, the transition of Templars into other orders was bureaucratically recorded. But in Scotland, there is silence, not the silence of absence, but of erasure. Archival researchers have identified telltale signs: discoloration on pages where text once existed, faint impressions from facing pages showing words no longer present, references in indices to documents that no longer exist in the collections they supposedly catalog. Who performed this erasure and why? Analysis of the documents themselves suggests multiple phases. Some censorship occurred immediately after the Templar suppression, likely by Scottish ecclesiastical authorities seeking to demonstrate compliance with papal directives while actually protecting refugees. The removal had to appear convincing to papal inspectors, who might later review records, yet leave enough intact that local operations could continue. Other redactions date to later periods, the 15th and 16th centuries, when Scotland was seeking legitimacy within the wider European community and could not afford to be seen as having harbored condemned heretics. The Reformation brought its own wave of destruction. Protestant reformers purged monastic libraries of superstitious materials, often failing to distinguish between objectionable religious content and historical records. Each layer of censorship compounded earlier ones, creating gaps within gaps, absences that obscured previous absences. What remained was a documentary landscape full of shadows. The silence between the lines told its own story. Something significant involving the Knights Templar had occurred in Scotland between 1307 and 1350. Something important enough that multiple generations felt compelled to conceal it, yet something that left traces despite their best efforts. Traces that modern archaeology and forensic historiography were only now beginning to decode. The fragmented nature of Templar records across different regions revealed not a single suppression narrative, but multiple parallel histories impossible to reconcile without acknowledging deliberate alteration. French sources, dominated by inquisitorial proceedings, portrayed Templars as defeated heretics whose order was righteously destroyed. English chronicles presented them more sympathetically, as victims of French aggression. Scottish sources, or rather the absence of substantial Scottish sources, suggested something else entirely, not destruction through persecution, but transformation through absorption. Mapping these divergent accounts geographically revealed patterns that illuminated what official histories obscured. In France, the density of Templar commanderies and the thoroughness of Philip the Thor's persecution created extensive documentation. Modern databases compiled arrest records, trial testimonies, property seizures covering hundreds of individual Templars. Yet even in France, anomalies appeared. Port records from La Rochelle, the Templar naval base on the Atlantic coast, showed unusual activity in September and early October 1307. Ships departing with no listed cargo or passengers, harbor fees paid in advance for vessels that never returned. Maritime historians noted that autumn Atlantic crossings were hazardous but not impossible. Experienced sailors with good ships could reach Scotland in favorable conditions. The Templars possessed such ships and maintained maritime operations for generations. Where those vessels went remained unrecorded in French sources, but the timing suggested deliberate evacuation. English records documented arrests in early 1308, but also noted Scotland's exclusion from proceedings. A preserved letter from Edward II to his sheriffs ordered seizure of Templar properties in our realm, explicitly acknowledging that Scottish properties were beyond his authority since Bruce controlled that kingdom. This acknowledgement preserved crucial evidence, not of what happened but of English awareness that something was happening beyond their observation. English chroniclers mentioned rumors of Templars fleeing to Scotland but provided no details, perhaps because they possessed none, or perhaps because acknowledging a Templar refuge in Scotland would grant legitimacy to Bruce's rebellious regime. Scottish sources presented the greatest challenge because they were most thoroughly redacted. What survived were primarily property records showing transfers of former Templar estates to the Hospitallers, as mandated by papal decree. But archaeological and linguistic evidence revealed these transfers were often nominal. At Maryculter in Aberdeenshire, formerly a Templar preceptory, the site was officially granted to the Hospitallers, but continued to be called the Temple in local records for centuries. The same pattern appeared at Temple in Midlothian, at Blantyre, at other sites. Place names preserved memory that official documents suppressed. Architectural analysis revealed significant modifications at these properties in the early 14th century. New fortifications, expanded chapels, residential quarters built in styles consistent with military religious architecture. If the Hospitallers were truly absorbing empty Templar properties, why the extensive construction? Unless the properties were not empty, but continuing to function under new management. Comparison of architectural elements across suspected Templar sites revealed coordinated activity by craftsmen working to common templates. Specific forms of crosses, geometric patterns, masons' marks appeared at multiple locations, suggesting shared knowledge transmitted through professional networks. At Rosslyn Chapel, built beginning in 1446, carvings included motifs found at earlier Templar sites, implying transmission of artistic tradition across generations. The divergent histories began to converge when viewed as complementary perspectives on complex events. French sources documented destruction in Philip's domains. English sources documented exclusion of Scotland from that destruction. Scottish sources documented property transfers, while archaeological evidence documented continued occupation and construction. Together, they mapped a process by which an international military order, officially dissolved, continued to exist in fragmented form, destroyed in some regions, driven underground in others, reconstituted under new identities where political circumstances permitted. Scotland was one such place. The evidence written in different scripts, buildings constructed when they should not exist, symbols persisting when they should have been forgotten, silences speaking of deliberate concealment, revealed not a handful of refugees hiding in obscurity, but systematic integration of Templar expertise into Scottish military infrastructure over decades. The pattern was strategic, concentrated along defensible positions, near royal strongholds, at locations crucial for Bruce's campaigns against English invasion. The suppression of the Knights Templar was not simply arrests and executions, but a systematic campaign to erase institutional memory and appropriate accumulated knowledge. What made the order dangerous to secular rulers was not merely wealth or military power, but the knowledge infrastructure developed over 2 centuries. Templars maintained extensive archives at their Paris headquarters and regional preceptories. Financial records, correspondence networks, maps of the Holy Land, diplomatic intelligence, ritual texts governing internal practices. When Philip IV's men seized the Paris Temple on October 13, 1307, securing these archives was a primary objective. French royal inventories listed confiscated documents but also noted significant gaps, records that should have existed but were not found, suggesting preemptive removal. What knowledge did the Templars possess that required suppression? Financial records alone would have been devastating to multiple European monarchs who owed the order substantial debts. Correspondence files would have documented political dealings, secret alliances, compromising information about royal and ecclesiastical figures. But some researchers argued the most sensitive material was religious and esoteric. The order's prolonged presence in Jerusalem with headquarters on the Temple Mount gave them access to sites and potentially texts unavailable to others. Medieval and Renaissance writers claimed Templars discovered ancient manuscripts beneath Solomon's Temple, including texts predating Christianity or containing alternative interpretations of Christian doctrine. While such claims lacked definitive proof, they reflected period beliefs that the order possessed knowledge deemed heretical by Orthodox Christianity. The charges brought against Templars in France centered on allegations of secret initiation rites, ceremonies involving symbolic denial of Christ, spitting near the cross, worship of an idol called Baphomet. Under torture, accused knights described these practices, though modern analysis recognizes confessions extracted through such methods as unreliable. What made accusations credible to inquisitors was not evidence, but the order's reputation for maintaining parallel traditions outside church control. Templars conducted chapter meetings in absolute secrecy, with guards ensuring no outsiders could hear proceedings. Their churches incorporated architectural elements, round or octagonal layouts, specific geometric proportions, astronomical alignments, that echoed older traditions predating Christianity. Whether such features represented merely incorporation of local building customs or something more deliberate remains debated, but they contributed to perceptions that the order possessed knowledge challenging orthodox religious authority. In Scotland, the question of forbidden knowledge took different dimensions. If Templar refugees brought archives, what happened to those documents? No collection of Templar manuscripts has been discovered in Scotland, yet transmission of specific symbols, architectural motifs, organizational structures suggested knowledge transfer occurred. The geographic distribution of post-suppression Templar symbolism revealed patterns suggesting organized preservation of tradition. Sites across southern Scotland displayed carved stones and architectural elements from the early 14th century, employing consistent symbolic vocabularies. This was not random convergence, but evidence of shared knowledge maintained across generations. Secret societies operating in Scotland from the 15th century forward claimed descent from Templar traditions. While direct institutional continuity cannot be proven, persistence of specific rituals, symbols, organizational structures implied transmission of knowledge through unofficial channels. The Sinclair family, who would build Rosslyn Chapel in 1446, had documented connections to both Crusades and early Scottish Freemasonry. William Sinclair held the hereditary position of Grand Master Mason of Scotland, granting authority over craft guilds. His chapel would contain architectural knowledge and symbolic vocabularies that, according to some researchers, should not have been available in 15th century Scotland unless preserved and transmitted secretly. The conspiracy was not that Templars were heretics. Modern scholarship has thoroughly debunked the charges against them, but that they represented an alternative locus of knowledge and authority outside church and crown control. Their suppression asserted that no organization could be permitted to operate with the independence Templars had enjoyed, that some escaped to Scotland, carrying archives and traditions, represented an ongoing threat to this consolidation. The subsequent erasure of evidence was about preventing survival and transmission of whatever knowledge the order possessed. Yet it survived anyway, encoded in symbols and structures, woven into traditions of successor organizations, a hidden current in Scottish history whose full extent remained to be mapped. The survival of Templar traditions in Scotland required transformation. Men who wore white mantles with red crosses could no longer do so without inviting arrest, even in a kingdom beyond immediate papal authority. The process by which warrior monks became something else, knights in service to Scottish lords, members of other religious orders, Landowners whose military past went unrecorded left traces in landscape and material culture. Tracking these traces required following not names but patterns, architectural styles, burial practices, symbolic vocabularies appearing when and where they should not have existed unless knowledge was transmitted from a suppressed source. The geographic distribution of suspected Templar absorption sites revealed a network aligned with Scotland's power centers and defensive needs. Robert the Bruce's power base lay in southwestern Scotland, Carrick, Annandale, Galloway, regions where Templar properties had existed before 1307. Bannockburn was fought near Stirling, controlling the gateway to the Highlands. Templar holdings at Temple in Midlothian, Mary Coulter in Aberdeenshire, multiple sites in the borders positioned them along primary invasion routes from England. If Bruce absorbed Templar refugees into military forces, these locations would have been strategic positions for experienced soldiers familiar with fortification, cavalry tactics, logistical organization. Archaeological evidence supported this interpretation. Fortifications at former Templar sites showed enhancement in the early 14th century, using construction techniques documented at Templar castles in Crusader states. The application of specialized military engineering knowledge occurred precisely when such expertise should have been unavailable, the order having been officially dissolved. Maritime connections provided another thread. Templars had maintained fleets, and records indicated ships disappeared from La Rochelle in weeks before October 1307 arrests. Scotland's west coast, particularly Argyll and the islands, offered harbors accessible to vessels crossing from France. Kilmartin, with its enigmatic grave slabs, lay in a region dominated by maritime culture where Norse, Irish, and Scottish influences overlapped. The carved stones included maritime symbols alongside military imagery, suggesting a population connected to seaborne networks. If Templar ships reached Scotland's western approaches, this was precisely where they would have made landfall. The region's political fragmentation, claimed by Scotland but partially independent under local lords, made it ideal for refugees seeking to avoid official scrutiny. Trade routes and monastic networks facilitated diffusion of Templar traditions across subsequent generations. Scottish monasteries maintained connections with continental houses, exchanging not only correspondence, but also monks, manuscripts, material culture. Several Scottish abbeys were affiliated with Cistercian or Augustinian orders that had maintained close relationships with Templars before suppression. When Templar refugees entered religious life under different identities, they brought architectural knowledge, manuscript illumination techniques, symbolic vocabularies. This would explain appearance of distinctively Templar motifs in churches and monasteries built decades after the order's official dissolution. The 15th century saw emergence of institutions claiming Templar heritage. Rosslyn Chapel, begun in 1446 by William Sinclair, 1st Earl of Caithness, stands as the most famous example. The Sinclair family had documented connections to Templars before 1307. Construction began 134 years after Templar dissolution, yet the chapel's elaborate carvings included symbols scholars have linked to Templar traditions. Whether this represented authentic transmission of knowledge or Renaissance-era romanticism about a legendary order remains debated. But the chapel demonstrated that by mid-15th century, Templar identity had transformed from heretical to heroic in Scottish cultural memory. Freemasonry's emergence in Scotland provided another possible vector for tradition survival. The earliest documented Masonic lodges appeared in late 16th and early 17th centuries, but Masonic historians argue traditions were older. Several Scottish lodges claimed Templar descent, incorporating narratives about the order's suppression and secret survival into rituals. While direct institutional continuity from Templars to Freemasons cannot be proven, symbolic overlap was striking. Both used architectural metaphors, emphasized moral instruction through allegorical ritual, maintained hierarchical degrees of initiation, employed common symbols. If Templar knowledge survived in Scotland, craft guilds and proto-Masonic organizations would have been logical repositories, operating semi-publicly, but with internal traditions kept from outsiders. The transformation from military religious order to dispersed initiatory tradition would have spread through exactly such channels, leaving no clear documentary trail, but imprinting symbols and structures on institutions continuing to this day. The breakthrough in understanding Rosslyn Chapel came not from excavation, but from recognizing what the structure itself communicated. Construction began in 1446, when William Sinclair received papal charter to build a collegiate chapel. Actual construction started in 1456, taking approximately 40 years. When William died in 1484, only the choir was complete. The planned cruciform church abandoned, leaving what exists today as a fragment of grander intentions. Yet this fragment contained more carved symbolism than any comparable medieval structure in Britain. Every surface displayed intricate stonework, biblical scenes, botanical motifs, geometric patterns, figures whose meanings remained subject to interpretation. Modern analysis focused on specific elements. The apprentice pillar, an ornately decorated column featuring winding spiral carvings, bore an inscription in Latin: "Wine is strong, a king is stronger, women are stronger still, but truth conquers all." This phrase from 1 Esdras suggested layers of meaning beyond surface decoration. Some researchers proposed the pillar represented the Norse Yggdrasil tree, cosmic axis uniting different realms, a connection supported by Norman roots of the Sinclair family and dragons carved at the pillar's base. Others noted similarities to allegorical references in Masonic ritual, though the chapel predated formal Freemasonry by centuries. The 213 carved cubes protruding from pillars and arches sparked particular interest. In 2007, after 27 years of research, father and son Thomas and Stuart Mitchell proposed these cubes represented cymatic patterns linked to musical notes. Their interpretation suggested the chapel encoded what they called the Rosslyn motet, music frozen in stone through geometric symbolism. Whether this represented genuine medieval encryption or modern overinterpretation remained contested, but it demonstrated the chapel's capacity to support multiple layers of meaning. More controversial were carvings some interpreted as depicting New World plants. Images over certain arches resembled maize or aloe, plants unknown in Europe before Columbus. This anomaly fueled theories that Sinclair family members had reached America before 1492, perhaps building on knowledge brought by Templar refugees who had accessed ancient maritime records. Mainstream botanists countered that the maize was stylized wheat or lilies, standard medieval decorative motifs misidentified by researchers seeking confirmation of preferred theories. What could not be disputed was the sealed vault beneath the chapel. A crypt had once been accessible via descending stairs at the rear, serving as burial place for generations of Sinclairs. This crypt had been sealed for centuries, spawning legends it concealed deeper vaults containing the Holy Grail, Templar treasure, or other relics. In 1837, when the second Earl of Rosslyn died requesting burial in the original vault, exhaustive searches over a week found no entrance. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in recent decades revealed voids beneath the floor, but excavation was prohibited due to concerns about structural integrity. What lies beneath remains physically inaccessible. Archaeological work during chapel restoration between 1997 and 2013 uncovered 3 skeletons. Radiocarbon dating placed 2 burials in mid-15th century, around the time of construction. Analysis suggested both were male, at least one having undertaken heavy physical activity indicated by well-developed musculature. They were buried in high-status locations within the chapel, suggesting importance, yet their identities remain unknown. Were they master craftsmen? Knights connected to the Sinclair family? The physical evidence raised questions it could not answer. The confrontation between history and mystery intensified as institutional forces resisted deeper investigation. The Rosslyn Chapel Trust, established in 1995, oversees preservation but also manages public expectations. Since Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code popularized theories about Templar connections and hidden vaults, visitor numbers soared. The chapel attracted hundreds of thousands annually, many drawn by legends the trust neither confirms nor explicitly debunks. Heritage officials walked careful lines between scholarly skepticism and visitor engagement, presenting speculative theories as local traditions without definitive resolution. Excavation permits for sites with suspected Templar associations faced bureaucratic obstacles. Permissions were delayed, restricted in scope, or denied citing structural concerns, though researchers questioned whether the real concern was protecting established interpretations rather than physical remains. Ground-penetrating radar surveys that could resolve questions about hidden chambers beneath temple and other sites encountered resistance, suggesting institutional discomfort with potentially disruptive discoveries. The mystery remains deliberately unresolved. Evidence confirms Templar presence, absorption, and continued influence. But the full nature of what was preserved, whether merely organizational expertise or something more esoteric, stays buried beneath layers of stone, silence, and institutional caution.